Florence, the cradle of beauty and the silent grave of secrets. In the year 1802, beneath its marble churches and golden light, whispers began of a painter whose art was not a gift, but a curse. His name was spoken with both admiration and fear. He painted faces that glowed with life, portraits so vivid that the eyes seemed to follow even when the room was empty. But soon, those who gazed too long at his work were found pale, breathless, lifeless, as though the canvas had drained the soul from their body. This story is not about art, it is about death, about a city where talent became poison and where beauty was laced with terror. Imagine the narrow streets of Florence at dusk. The sky burns with fading crimson, and the bells toll in hollow echoes. Behind shuttered windows families gather, but their eyes dart nervously toward canvases hanging on the walls. Whispers spread of patrons who collapsed in their sleep, of noble women whose laughter was silenced forever after posing for a portrait, of merchants whose wealth could not protect them from the silent gaze of painted eyes. The painter was called cursed, condemned by God, touched by something darker than human imagination. They said he mixed not only paint, but blood, ash, and venom into his colors. They said his brushes carried whispers, strokes guided by unseen hands. They said his art was alive, hungry, feeding on the very people it captured. And yet, despite the fear, the elite of Florence continued to seek him. Because beauty, when it promises immortality, always tempts those who cannot resist. The introduction to this tale is not gentle. It is a door slammed shut behind you, leaving no way back, only forward into darkness. As you walk through this cursed narrative, you will hear the voices of the victims, the footsteps of the painter, the silence of Florence watching as art became execution. You will feel the dread that grew in every home where his paintings hung, the slow poison of suspicion, the terror that beauty itself might kill. His studio was described as a cathedral of shadows. The smell of turpentine mingled with the copper scent of something metallic. Canvases lined the walls, some half-finished, others draped with cloths to hide their terrible gaze. People who entered said they felt watched, as though the painted figures were whispering among themselves, waiting, choosing. He was not a man of crowds. His presence was quiet, almost invisible, yet unforgettable. Those who saw him swore he carried a sadness in his eyes, a torment, as though he himself was enslaved by the art he created. But others swore they saw something colder, a satisfaction, a hidden pleasure in watching fear bloom in the faces of his patrons. Florence, a city of art, could not believe such darkness could grow from a painter's brush. But the graves began to fill, and denial turned to horror. The introduction to this story is a warning, a reminder that beauty and death often walk side by side, that some works of art are not meant to be seen and some artists do not create, they consume. Tonight, you will hear of a painter whose hands may have been guided by something unholy, whose portraits became prisons, whose legacy was not admiration but dread. This is not only history. This is the haunting echo of Florence in 1802, where the line between brushstroke and blood was erased forever. The curse of the painter is not just in the past. Even now, they say, if one of his paintings surfaces, death follows. Collectors whisper of vanished buyers, of houses where shadows move behind painted eyes. Some stories never die. They linger, waiting for someone curious enough to look too closely. This is one of them. The year was 1802, and Florence stood like a jewel upon the Tuscan hills, bathed in sunlight by day, cloaked in candlelit silence by night. It was a city proud of its art, its churches, its galleries, its very identity carved from marble and color. Here the legacy of great masters still whispered through halls of museums and echoed in every square. The people lived with art as others lived with air. But even in such beauty, shadows always crept. Among the many painters who wandered the city with brushes and canvases, one man stood apart. His name was Matteo Bianchi, though most avoided saying it aloud. He was not celebrated in the salons. He was not commissioned by the Medici heirs. He worked quietly, accepting private requests. His name passed through whispers more than announcements. Yet those who dared to see his work spoke of it with trembling voices. His portraits did not merely resemble their subjects. They trapped them, caught their very essence, as though the living breath of the model had been swallowed whole by the canvas. The beginning of his story is hard to trace. Some say Matteo came from a line of painters cursed since birth. Others whispered his mother died screaming during childbirth, leaving him marked. There were rumors of a father who studied forbidden arts, dabbling in alchemy and strange texts. Some believed the painter was not merely human, but a vessel for something darker, an instrument chosen to weave death through beauty. His childhood was marked by solitude. No one recalled him playing with other children in the crowded streets. He was seen instead sketching endlessly, filling scraps of parchment with eyes, always eyes, staring from every corner. By adolescence, he apprenticed briefly with an old craftsman, but the master dismissed him within months, muttering of a boy who would not follow instructions, who painted things no one had taught him, things no one wished to see. From there, Matteo vanished into obscurity, painting alone, his skill sharpening like a blade honed in shadows. By the turn of the century, he had begun to attract clients, not the public, but the wealthy behind closed doors, who wanted their likeness captured in secrecy. A merchant's wife, a banker, a young nobleman, and one by one they died. Not immediately. Days, weeks, sometimes months later, but always the same. A sudden wasting away, a silent collapse, a gaze locked on something unseen. The city ignored coincidence at first. People die after all. But when bodies began to pile, when names were linked, when each had sat before the same easel, the whispers began. The background of Florence in this year was one of beauty hiding corruption. Streets bustling with carriages and market cries by day, yet heavy with suspicion at night. Families lit candles in their homes and prayed. Churches rang bells for the dead, yet no priest dared speak against the painter aloud. He lived in a small house on the edge of the city, where ivy climbed the stones and windows stayed shuttered. Few entered, fewer left. Those who posed within often never lived long enough to return. The curse of Matteo Bianchi grew like wildfire, yet the elite continued to seek him, believing that art which carried death must also carry immortality. To be painted by him was to live forever, even if life itself was cut short. Here lies the cruel contradiction of Florence, a city where beauty was worshipped, even when it carried poison. The background of this tale is not only about a man, but about a people blinded by their own desires, a society that invited death willingly into their homes because they longed to see themselves eternal on canvas. They could not resist. They would not resist. And so the painter's story spread, tangled in rumors, drowning in unanswered questions. Florence carried secrets within its stones, and Matteo Bianchi became one of its darkest. His name passed through candlelit corridors like a curse, whispered at dinner tables, spoken behind gloved hands in the marketplace. Still, curiosity and greed pushed people toward him, for his paintings were unlike any others. The background to his reputation grew heavier with each death, until even children spoke of him in hushed tones, calling him the shadow painter. Records from the time reveal fragments of his presence. A priest's diary mentions visiting a home where a young woman lay cold, her body untouched by violence, but her face twisted in silent terror. On the wall hung her portrait, the eyes wide, almost alive, the lips curled as though they had whispered her final scream. In another case, a wealthy merchant collapsed after commissioning Matteo, leaving his widow alone in a grand house where servants swore they heard laughter echo from the canvas at night. These stories spread across Florence until the painter became less a man and more a myth. Some believed his brushes were dipped in poisoned oils, crafted from herbs that carried sickness. Others claimed he had bargained with the devil, exchanging his soul for talent, and in return his art would devour lives. Even those who dismissed superstition could not explain why his clients perished so frequently, so mysteriously, so quietly. The painter himself did little to quiet the rumors. He was rarely seen outside his studio. When glimpsed in public, he wore dark clothes and moved swiftly as if avoiding eyes. Yet when people described him, they spoke of his gaze, intense, unblinking, the eyes of a man who studied more than faces, who pierced into the very soul. The background of Florence at this time was steeped in both beauty and paranoia. Plagues had passed through decades earlier, leaving scars of fear. Superstition lingered in every alley, whispered in every church pew. Against this backdrop, a painter whose portrait seemed to bring death was not merely scandalous, it was terrifying. And yet the rich desired him still. They wanted to be remembered in eternity. They wanted their beauty, their power, their youth captured forever. They wanted what every mortal craves, to defy time. Matteo gave them that promise, and they paid with their lives. Stories tell of a countess who begged him to paint her daughter, claiming beauty so pure must be immortalized. The girl was painted, the canvas breathtaking, but within weeks her laughter was gone, her body buried. The portrait remained, the face staring from the wall as if mocking those who grieved. This was the twisted gift of Matteo, beauty that killed. Florence did not know whether to condemn him or worship him. His art was a paradox of desire and dread, a reflection of the city itself. The background is essential because it shows how easily people ignored warnings when blinded by vanity. They saw the graves but still sought his brush. They feared his curse but could not resist his promise. This is not only the story of one man, but of an entire society complicit in its own haunting. a city that chose beauty over life and paid for it with silence, suspicion, and blood. As the year moved forward, the whispers around Matteo Bianchi thickened like fog over the Arno River. What began as quiet unease turned into something darker, something heavier, as if the very air in Florence was weighed down by dread. Families who had once proudly displayed their portraits now kept them covered, draped in cloth as though ashamed of what hung upon their walls. Servants muttered of footsteps in the night, of painted faces shifting when no one watched, of eyes that seemed to gleam with cruel recognition. The build-up to the painter's infamy was not swift but slow, deliberate like poison spreading unseen through veins. At first the deaths had been dismissed as coincidence, tragic but ordinary. Illness was common, and Florence had long been touched by unseen sickness. But patterns emerged, undeniable even to those who wished to look away. A nobleman painted in March died in April. His widow, who sat for her portrait in June, was buried before autumn. A banker's son, barely 20, boasted of being painted by the cursed hand and within a fortnight was found cold in his bed, his mouth frozen in what looked like a silent scream. The buildup of fear was everywhere. Priests began to mention sin and temptation in sermons, never naming the painter but alluding to beauty that led to damnation. Mothers warned daughters to refuse his commissions, though many daughters ignored them, eager for the eternal image of youth. The marketplace swirled with rumors. Some said Matteo worked with powders that carried death, mixed secretly into paint. Others swore he captured souls and imprisoned them in his portraits so that the body was left empty, withering like a husk. A few claimed they had seen his paintings breathe, the chest of a figure rise and fall as though still alive. These rumors might have been dismissed in another city, but Florence was already steeped in superstition, and death gave weight to every tale. The buildup reached new intensity when a wealthy magistrate, Lorenzo Gori, commissioned Matteo to paint his entire family. Neighbors whispered that this was madness, that he was inviting ruin into his home. But the magistrate dismissed the fears, boasting that no curse could touch him, that power and faith protected his household. The portraits were completed in silence. The magistrate displayed them proudly, showing them to guests as proof that he feared nothing. Within weeks, tragedy struck. His youngest child fell ill, then his wife, then himself. Their bodies wasted away as if something unseen was draining them, leaving them shadows of themselves. By winter, the entire family lay buried. Servants swore the portraits laughed when no one looked. This was no longer coincidence. This was a pattern written in blood. The buildup of terror reached every street. The name Matteo Bianchi became a warning, a curse, a story told to frighten children into obedience. Yet still there were those who desired his brush. Desire and dread walked hand in hand. To be painted by him was to step into legend, to risk death for eternal beauty. The buildup of this tale is not only about deaths, but about the madness of a city that courted danger willingly. Florence was bewitched, unable to look away, unable to turn from the painter who gave them immortality wrapped in death. His studio became a forbidden shrine. Those who entered said the walls were lined with unfinished canvases, half-formed faces watching with hollow eyes. The air smelled of turpentine and something sharper, metallic like blood. His tools were worn, his hands steady, his gaze unblinking. The buildup of fear was not only about the curse, but about the man himself. People swore he never aged, that his face looked the same from decade to decade, as if the years touched others but not him. They whispered that perhaps he too was bound by the curse, that he lived only because others died. Whether true or not, it did not matter. The city believed it, and belief gave the curse its power. Florence stood on the edge of hysteria, caught between admiration and horror. And in this tension, in this rising storm of whispers and shadows, the legend of the cursed painter grew stronger than ever. The streets of Florence carried stories like the wind, and the buildup of terror around Matteo Bianchi turned into an unstoppable tide. His studio became the heart of rumors, a place no one wished to enter, yet everyone spoke about. Children dared each other to walk past it at night, and some swore they heard voices whispering behind the shuttered windows, not the voice of one man but many, as though the painted souls within his canvases still cried out from the silence of their prison. Servants who once worked for wealthy patrons whispered in taverns of portraits that seemed to change after nightfall, of eyes that glistened with moisture, of lips that curled into faint, mocking smiles. One woman claimed she had dusted a canvas and felt it pulse beneath her hand as though it were alive. Fear and fascination grew together, feeding each other. Every death added fuel to the fire. Every coffin that left a noble house became another nail in the painter's legend. The buildup took a darker turn when rumors spread that Matteo himself had no shadow. Merchants claimed to see him in the streets and noticed that the sunlight did not bend around him as it did for others, that he walked like a figure half-formed, neither man nor phantom. Others said his reflection did not appear in mirrors, that he carried with him the mark of the damned. These stories could not be proven, but they were repeated often enough that they became part of his myth. Florence was a city that loved stories, but this story was more than entertainment. It was terror woven into everyday life. The buildup of his reputation also drew outsiders, travelers who came to Florence not to see the Duomo or the galleries, but to glimpse the cursed painter whose name had reached beyond Tuscany. Some sought his services, curious and reckless, believing death to be a price worth paying for immortal beauty. Others came only to see if the stories were true. Many left shaken, swearing they would never return, their faces pale from what they had seen within his studio. The city itself began to change. People stopped trusting beauty. Paintings that once adorned halls were hidden under cloth. Mirrors were avoided in dim light, and artists found themselves shunned by fearful patrons. A shadow fell upon the very craft Florence was most proud of. Painters who had nothing to do with Matteo found themselves accused, their work ignored, their names tarnished by association. The buildup of suspicion spread like infection. Even the church grew restless. Priests began to preach more directly, warning of vanity, warning of cursed works, warning of art that stole the soul. Some whispered that Matteo should be condemned, exiled, even executed, but none dared confront him directly, for who would risk being painted by his gaze? It was said he could capture a soul with a glance even without his brush. The buildup reached its breaking point when yet another tragedy struck. A young bride, painted on the eve of her wedding, was found lifeless in her chamber before dawn. The canvas still fresh on its easel, her eyes glowed with unnatural brightness, as though mocking the life that had just been stolen. This death sent the city into panic. The whispers became shouts, the suspicion became anger, and Florence, once silent in its fear, now demanded answers. The buildup of the legend was complete. Matteo Bianchi was no longer just a painter. He was a phantom of Florence, a curse wrapped in human skin, a figure who carried both beauty and death in every stroke of his hand. The fear that once whispered through Florence had become a roar, and in the center of that storm stood Matteo Bianchi, the cursed painter whose name no one dared say aloud. By now, the city could no longer ignore the pattern of death. Graves filled, noble houses went quiet, and yet the portraits remained, each one more lifelike than the last, each one holding a presence that made the living tremble. The climax of this tale began when the city finally decided to confront what had long been avoided. It was the autumn of 1802, when a council of priests, magistrates, and noblemen gathered under flickering candlelight to discuss the painter. Fear was carved into every face at that table. They spoke of the endless deaths, of the curse that bled through every portrait, of the families ruined by beauty that should never have been captured. Some demanded he be exiled, others that his works be burned, a few that he himself be put to death. But even among the most fearful there lingered hesitation, for the painter's gaze was said to kill, and who would dare face him directly? Still, the decision was made. Something had to be done. A small group was chosen to investigate, to step inside his studio and confront him with the weight of Florence's fear. They were men of faith and law, but none were without trembling hearts. The night they approached his home was heavy with silence. The streets emptied as though the entire city held its breath. His house stood on the edge of Florence, its windows shuttered, its walls overgrown with ivy that seemed to twist like grasping hands. No smoke rose from its chimney, no sound leaked from within, and yet the air itself seemed alive, thick with unseen eyes. They knocked, and the door creaked open as if waiting. Inside, the air smelled of oils and metal, of decay disguised by turpentine. The men stepped cautiously, their eyes darting to the walls where portraits hung in dim candlelight. What they saw froze them in place. Faces stared back at them, dozens of them, each so lifelike it was as if they were trapped behind glass rather than painted on canvas. Some looked familiar, the banker, the countess, the bride who had died before her wedding. Their eyes glistened, and though none spoke, the silence itself felt like screaming. The men claimed later that the portraits breathed, that they saw the faintest rise and fall of painted chests, the flicker of movement in painted eyes, and in the center of it all stood Matteo, his hands stained with paint, his gaze calm, almost welcoming. He spoke little, but his voice was soft, smooth, carrying the weight of centuries. He denied no accusations. Instead, he smiled faintly and told them beauty always demanded a price and that Florence itself had chosen this path. They accused him of murder, of witchcraft, of blasphemy, but his calmness unnerved them more than any anger could have. He told them they were not the first to confront him, and would not be the last. One of the men, a young priest, lost his nerve and demanded the portraits be destroyed. At his words, the air grew heavy and every candle flickered. The priest raised his hand toward a canvas, but before he could touch it, he collapsed to the floor, lifeless. His eyes stared wide open, fixed upon the painted faces. The others stumbled back in horror. Matteo simply watched, his gaze unblinking. They fled, leaving the body behind, the echo of their footsteps swallowed by the silence of the studio. That night sealed his legend. Word of the priest's death spread like wildfire, and now even the boldest among Florence's elite refused to seek his brush. His curse was no longer rumor but undeniable, proven by the collapse of a holy man before witnesses. The climax of the tale was not only about death but about revelation. The city now believed without doubt that Matteo's art was a prison of souls, that his brush did not paint but captured, that each portrait was a body stolen and bound forever. His clients had not merely died, they had been devoured by canvas. Fear turned to rage. Crowds gathered outside his house, torches raised, demanding his death. Stones were thrown at his shutters, curses screamed into the night. But Matteo never emerged. The house stood silent, watching as though alive. Some swore they saw faces peering from behind the shutters, not his, but those of the dead. The climax built higher when a fire was set at the edge of his home, flames licking the ivy. But before it spread, a storm broke across Florence, sudden and violent, extinguishing the blaze. People called it a sign, some saying God protected him, others whispering it was the devil's hand shielding his servant. The council met again, divided and desperate. Some argued he should be hunted down, others that his house should be sealed, the painter left to rot with his cursed art. In the end, fear outweighed courage. The council declared his home condemned. No one would enter. The doors were sealed with iron, the windows bricked shut. His name struck from records. But whispers claim Matteo remained inside, unbothered, still painting in the dark. And if that was true, then each brushstroke meant another soul trapped forever. Years passed, yet the story of the cursed painter refused to fade. Children whispered it in alleyways, lovers warned each other in hushed tones, and the church wove it into sermons about vanity and sin. Florence lived with the shadow of Matteo Bianchi, not as a man but as a wound that would not heal. His sealed house stood like a monument, ivy thickening until it strangled the stone, shutters sagging with rot. But at night, people swore the windows glowed faintly, as though lit by unseen candles, as though paintings still multiplied within. The climax deepened when the heirs of the dead began demanding answers. Families ruined by loss, noble bloodlines ended too soon. They wanted justice, or at least closure. They pressed the council to open the house again, to retrieve the portraits and destroy them, believing it would free the souls trapped inside. Yet no one dared enter. Soldiers refused. Priests muttered excuses. Even thieves avoided the place. The fear was too deep, the memory of the priest's sudden death too sharp. The city tried to move on, but the curse did not allow forgetting. Strange events began to bleed into daily life. At markets, merchants reported glimpsing painted eyes in barrels of wine. At churches, shadows clung to the walls like figures that did not belong. In noble homes, families whispered that their dead kin's voices echoed at night, calling from beyond the canvas. The belief grew that Matteo's curse had seeped out, that Florence itself was becoming his masterpiece. The breaking point came when a child vanished, the daughter of a wealthy merchant. She had been playing near the condemned house, chasing a ball that rolled against its rotting door. Witnesses swore they heard her laughter echo inside, though no door opened, no window shifted. When searchers forced their way into the sealed house, they found no child, only a new portrait resting on an easel. The paint was fresh, the eyes glistened, and though no one dared step close, every soul present recognized her face. The girl was gone, and yet she watched them from the canvas, trapped, alive, suffering. Panic consumed Florence. Now it was not only nobles who trembled, but the common folk, the workers, the children. No one felt safe. They whispered that as long as the painter lived, anyone might be taken. The council, once paralyzed by fear, was now cornered by rage. They decreed Matteo Bianchi an enemy of the city, a heretic whose house must be destroyed stone by stone. An army of men was gathered, carrying torches, axes, and holy symbols. Priests marched at their side, chanting prayers to banish whatever power clung to him. The mob stormed the house, breaking through its sealed doors, hacking through ivy that bled sap like dark blood. Inside, they found the air colder than night, thick with a weight that pressed on their chests. The walls were covered with portraits, hundreds now, faces familiar and strange, faces of nobles and peasants, faces of the lost. The paintings shimmered as though wet, eyes shifting, mouths twitching. Some swore they heard whispers calling their names. And there he was, Matteo, sitting in the center, brush in hand, calm as the night they had last seen him. His hair was long now, streaked with silver, but his gaze was unchanged, steady, unblinking, eternal. He did not flee, did not fight. He simply painted, as if the mob were nothing but another detail on his canvas. The soldiers rushed him, swords drawn, but one by one they stumbled and fell, clutching their throats, gasping for air. Their bodies twisted unnaturally, as if unseen hands dragged their souls out. One soldier screamed as his likeness appeared on the wall, a portrait forming with impossible speed. His cries echoed even after his body went still, his eyes alive forever in paint. Chaos erupted. Torches dropped, flames spreading across the room, smoke curling toward the ceiling. Some tried to strike the portraits, but the canvases refused to tear, blades glancing off like steel. Priests shouted prayers, voices trembling, but their faith cracked under the weight of that cursed gaze. Matteo rose slowly, almost solemnly, and said only one sentence. "Art is eternal, but flesh is weak." His voice carried through the chaos, and in that moment many swore the faces on the wall smiled, twisted grins of the damned. The fire spread faster, devouring wood, licking the edges of portraits. But even as the heat grew unbearable, the paintings did not burn. The mob fled, terrified, dragging the wounded and leaving behind the dead. Flames consumed the house, the roof collapsing, sparks scattering into the night sky. The crowd outside cheered, believing the nightmare ended, believing the cursed painter finally destroyed. But as the fire raged, some swore they saw silhouettes dancing in the flames, not bodies burning, but figures moving freely, laughing, celebrating. And among them the shape of Matteo, brush in hand, painting with fire as if the destruction itself were his canvas. By dawn, the house was gone. Only ash remained, blackened stone jutting from the earth like bones. The council declared victory. The curse ended. The painter destroyed. Bells rang across Florence. Sermons preached of divine justice. But whispers never died. Days later, people began to notice strange things. In burned walls nearby, faint outlines of faces appeared, as if smoke had stained portraits into the stone. In the ashes, a single canvas survived untouched, the colors bright as the day they were painted. On it was the girl who had vanished, her eyes wide, her lips parted in a silent scream. The city buried the painting deep beneath the cathedral, sealing it behind iron and stone, praying it would never be seen again. Yet even sealed, some claimed they could hear faint sobbing beneath the church floor. And as years rolled on, rumors spread that new paintings began to appear in Florence. Anonymous portraits left at doorsteps, each lifelike, each haunting, each followed by the sudden death of its subject. No one knew who painted them. Some said a secret apprentice carried on his work. Others whispered that Matteo himself never died, that his soul slipped into his paintings, living forever in canvas. But the most terrifying belief was the simplest, that Florence itself had become his studio, and that everyone within was merely waiting for the moment his brush would find them. The city of Florence trembled in the wake of Matteo Bianchi's cursed artistry. Families that had once sought his brush now sat in haunted silence, staring at walls that carried empty spaces where portraits had been removed or hidden. Graves multiplied, whispers spread, and the air itself seemed thick with the lingering weight of souls captured in paint. The aftermath of his terror was more than death. It was the erosion of trust, the collapse of faith in beauty, the corruption of pride. Merchants refused to host dinner parties for fear that guests might appear on a canvas. Noblemen avoided social gatherings, and children were warned not to stray near the ruins of his condemned home. The city council attempted to record the events, to create a ledger of deaths and disappearances, but the tally was incomplete. Many names unrecorded, many victims lost to time. People could not speak the painter's name aloud without shivering. Even scribes hesitated, leaving gaps in documents where his name belonged. Priests delivered sermons warning against vanity, against seeking beauty beyond mortal limits, claiming Matteo's works as a grim lesson of divine punishment. Yet Florence could not forget. The aftermath of each portrait lingered. A psychological plague for those who had survived his brush were marked by memory. Families would weep quietly over empty seats at tables, remembering children or spouses who had been taken, imagining them trapped in invisible prisons behind painted eyes. Some tried to burn his remaining works, though a single painting stubbornly survived every attempt, its surface untouched, its eyes glistening with a cruel awareness. The aftermath did not spare the elite, for they had invited him into their homes, had demanded immortality through art, and had been repaid with death. Servants whispered in fear, recounting tales of the dead rising slightly from their beds at night, shadows moving across walls, faint cries heard beneath the floorboards. Florence itself seemed haunted, each cobbled street echoing the cries of the victims, each echo a reminder of the city's complicity. Scholars debated what had occurred, some claiming the painter possessed supernatural powers, others attributing it to a malefic charm, a curse passed from parent to child. Whatever the explanation, the aftermath was undeniable. Fear had taken root, threading through the city like ivy, impossible to eradicate. Families abandoned homes, fled to countryside estates, or sent their children to distant relatives, hoping to escape the reach of painted eyes. Merchants shuttered shops for weeks, refusing to display art, while even painters of ordinary skill were accused of continuing Matteo's dark legacy. The psychological toll was staggering. People slept with torches, refused to look in mirrors, and avoided gatherings where portraits hung. Every house carried suspicion. Every gift carried potential death. And yet, human desire remained, a morbid curiosity that would not allow Florence to forget entirely. The aftermath was not merely the absence of life, but the presence of a pervasive dread that no council decree could erase. Stories of the dead circulated endlessly, growing with each retelling, turning Florence into a city haunted not only by ghosts, but by memory itself. Some claimed the cursed portrait still spoke, faint whispers emerging when the moonlight fell at a certain angle, faint cries echoing through corridors. Families would leave rooms untouched for months, fearing that to move the painting was to invite doom. The aftermath also revealed strange patterns in the deaths. Many victims had been painted weeks or months before dying, as if the brush had trapped a clock within the canvas, counting down the moments of life. Medical men were called to investigate, but science failed to provide answers. Bodies showed no cause, no illness, no poison, only an unnatural wasting away that defied explanation. Florence's finest doctors left the city shaken, their reputations diminished by a power they could not comprehend. The aftermath of Matteo's terror extended beyond death. People spoke of a strange weight pressing down on homes, of portraits subtly shifting when no one was looking, of shadows moving independently from their owners. Children refused to eat in rooms with paintings, women abandoned bedrooms, and even animals reacted violently to certain canvases, yelping and hiding. Scholars, priests, and city officials agreed on one thing: the painter's work had unleashed something that could not be contained. Each surviving portrait became a monument to fear, each death a testament to the inescapable reach of his artistry. Over the years, attempts were made to recover or destroy the remaining works, but they proved elusive. Some were lost in private collections, others disappeared entirely. Rumors circulated that hidden apprentices continued his techniques in secret, extending the aftermath across generations. Families remained vigilant, locking doors, covering mirrors, and avoiding art entirely. Yet the painter's presence lingered. The aftermath was not confined to Florence alone. Letters and travelers carried whispers of cursed works beyond Tuscany. Merchants spoke of canvases arriving in distant lands, each bringing misfortune, each bearing the mark of the painter's cruel hand. Fear became a currency. Survival demanded vigilance, prayer, and avoidance of vanity. Florence learned the hardest lesson: that beauty without caution can carry ruin, that desire can blind, and that a single brushstroke could condemn a soul. Even today, the aftermath persists in memory. Stories are told in hushed tones. Tourists glance nervously at galleries, and locals carry warnings passed through generations. The city is forever marked by what Matteo Bianchi wrought, an eternal reminder that art can capture more than likeness, that beauty can cage, and that in seeking immortality, Florence had invited a terror that no law, priest, or fire could ever fully erase. The echoes of Matteo Bianchi's terror persisted like a shadow over Florence, creeping into every corner of the city. Even the most cautious families felt the pressure of unseen eyes, their every movement measured against the lingering dread. Portraits that survived the fire were hidden in cellars, locked behind iron gates, and yet whispers claimed they could be heard moving at night, subtle shifts in canvas as if breathing. Servants who had once fled the painter's household described waking to faint voices calling from empty rooms, footsteps pacing across floors when no one was present, and the soft rustle of silk as if someone invisible had brushed past. Merchants refused to sell paintings or commission portraits, and even sculptors avoided working with clay that might mirror Matteo's cursed precision. The city council imposed strict decrees forbidding display of his works, yet they were powerless against fear. No law could calm a city haunted by what it had witnessed. The aftermath of his deeds extended into social order. Families that had commissioned him were ostracized, suspected of inviting death upon themselves, or of harboring cursed objects. Nobles who survived the brush's influence were avoided in public, shunned at gatherings, whispered about in shadowed halls. Every household kept doors locked, windows shuttered, and mirrors covered. Children were warned not to play near abandoned houses, lest the painter's spirit claim them. Scholars attempted to analyze the events, documenting patterns of death, investigating the oddities of the surviving portraits, but every attempt to rationalize or record was met with failure. Bodies that should have shown signs of illness remained mysteriously unharmed until they collapsed without explanation. Science offered no answers. Only superstition thrived. The aftermath extended beyond Florence. Travelers brought stories back to their homelands, of portraits that seemed to watch, of shadows moving independently, of quiet deaths following the appearance of a painting. Italy's reputation as a city of art was forever tinged with fear, every brushstroke scrutinized, every gallery approached with caution. In the homes of surviving patrons, life was governed by paranoia. Nights were long, filled with sleepless hours listening for unnatural movements. Families ate in silence, speaking only in whispers, their conversations cautious, afraid to attract attention from unseen forces. Some claimed that speaking directly of Matteo could summon his presence, that mentioning the painter aloud was an invitation for his gaze to descend once more. Priests performed blessings, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers over remaining works. Yet even divine protection seemed limited in effect. Shadows would bend, eyes would gleam faintly in the dark, and servants swore that whispers continued to call names. Over time, Florence attempted to heal, to rebuild trust in art and beauty in daily life. Yet the psychological footprint of Matteo's curse remained. Generations grew up knowing the stories, passing warnings to children who had never seen the painter, instructing them never to desire more than ordinary skill in a portrait. Even decades later, new painters were viewed with suspicion, their work compared to the legendary terror of Matteo's hand. Attempts to destroy surviving canvases were met with strange failures. Flames did not consume paint, iron gates bent without explanation, locks broke mysteriously, leaving works accessible as if fate ensured the painter's legacy endured. Rumors circulated of apprentices or secret followers, spreading his influence beyond Florence. It was said that wherever his style appeared, misfortune followed. Families prepared for the possibility that any commission could be a death sentence. Even in private homes, people covered mirrors and kept lights burning at night, fearing the silent power of the cursed artist. The aftermath was more than loss of life. It was the loss of innocence, of confidence, of faith in human skill. Art became a dangerous pursuit, a gamble with fate, a reminder that beauty, when created by cursed hands, could be more deadly than war or plague. Florence learned to live in vigilance. Children were raised with stories of the painter's wrath. Adults measured every decision in fear, and the city itself bore the scars of paranoia. Etched into the culture as deeply as the canals, the bridges, and the cobbled streets, the aftermath demonstrated that no law, no council, no fire, and no prayer could fully erase the shadow of one man's curse. Matteo Bianchi's legacy endured in whispers, in eyes that seemed to follow, in portraits that survived against all odds, and in the collective memory of a city that had gazed too long at immortal beauty and paid the ultimate price. The shadow of Matteo Bianchi did not end with his supposed death or the burning of his house. Florence carried a weight that could not be named, a mystery that refused to be solved. Scholars, priests, and survivors alike pondered how a man's brush could snatch life itself, how paint could imprison souls. Every explanation fell short. Every theory faltered under the evidence of surviving portraits and continuing deaths. The mystery began with the paintings themselves. No fire could consume them. No blade could pierce them. The eyes of those trapped within seemed aware, glimmering in candlelight, tracking movements of the living. Some claimed the brush carried the soul itself. Others whispered of ancient curses, inherited from dark forces beyond comprehension. Attempts to study the works were met with inexplicable phenomena. Lights flickered when canvases were touched, sudden chills ran through rooms, and shadows appeared that had no source. Science failed utterly. Physicians and natural philosophers could find no cause for the deaths that followed each new portrait. The cursed painter became not only a legend, but an enigma, an eternal question mark dangling over Florence and beyond. Over the years, reports surfaced of strange events connected to the painter. New portraits appeared in distant towns, carried anonymously. always followed by illness or sudden death of the subjects. Some claimed the hand of Matteo had survived, perhaps through apprentices, perhaps through some hidden immortality. Others argued it was impossible, yet the patterns were undeniable. Families swore that before the appearance of a new painting, they felt a presence, a weight in the air, a chill that seemed to anticipate the brush. The cursed art did not discriminate. Nobles, peasants, merchants, even children, anyone could become a victim. No one could predict who would be next, which face would appear on canvas, or when the brush would strike. The mystery deepened as the city attempted to track surviving works. Canvases were hidden, locked and buried beneath stone, yet they reappeared elsewhere, untouched, painted with fresh cruelty. Some were found years later in abandoned homes, untouched by decay, their subjects still trapped in painted eternity. Priests theorized that Matteo's soul had merged with the art itself, creating a mechanism beyond human understanding. Attempts to destroy the works failed repeatedly. Fires consumed only the wooden frame. The painted image remained intact, almost glowing with a sinister light. The city's belief in divine protection waned, replaced by an understanding that some forces could not be governed by faith alone. The mystery also spread into daily life. Citizens refused to have portraits made, avoided mirrors, and spoke sparingly of any who had been touched by the painter's hand. Children were warned never to enter abandoned houses, travelers were cautioned against curiosity, and merchants were hesitant to display art that could carry latent danger. Even generations later, whispers persisted that a glance at the wrong painting could steal a life, trap a soul, or invite a curse. Attempts to rationalize the phenomenon failed entirely. Natural explanations could not account for the lifelike quality of the portraits, the awareness in the painted eyes, or the immediacy of death following a subject's capture. Philosophers, alchemists, and clerics debated endlessly, yet no consensus emerged. Every investigation led to more questions. Every answer birthed deeper fear. The mystery of Matteo Bianchi was compounded by the fact that none of the surviving portraits seemed static. Witnesses claimed subtle changes, a faint smile forming overnight, eyes glinting more sharply, the tilt of a head shifting as if observing the room. These slight alterations suggested an ongoing presence within the canvas, an active intelligence that defied logic. People began to suspect that the painter's hand was no longer required, that the works themselves had become autonomous agents of terror. Further complicating matters were rumors that some individuals could sense the painter's influence even without seeing a portrait. Merchants claimed a sudden chill in a room, a flicker in candlelight, a whisper in the corner, warnings of impending doom. Families prepared for events they could not predict, guardians standing watch over portraits, praying for protection that never fully came. The mystery extended beyond Florence. Letters and tales arrived from distant cities describing the appearance of cursed works, sometimes accompanied by death, sometimes by madness, sometimes by unexplained vanishings. Some claimed the painter had discovered a method of preserving consciousness in paint, a technique unknown to science, or had invoked a curse so profound it transcended both death and distance. Even in modern times, historians find traces of his influence. Anonymous portraits in private collections, unsigned paintings with lifelike eyes, and reports of sudden illness following viewing echo the events of centuries past. The city's memory, museums, and archives hold fragments of the truth, but the complete mechanism of Matteo Bianchi's power remains unknown. Every attempt to fully document the cursed painter's work only reinforces the haunting mystery, that art, beauty, and death can intertwine in ways beyond comprehension. Florence continues to whisper his name, a reminder that some questions are meant to remain unanswered, that some horrors are eternal, and that the boundary between life and painted eternity is fragile, thin, and easily crossed. The enigma of Matteo Bianchi's cursed artistry spread far beyond the confines of Florence, weaving itself into the fabric of fear that stretched across Italy and into neighboring lands. Travelers whispered of lifelike portraits appearing in distant cities, of eyes that glimmered with unholy awareness, and of sudden, inexplicable deaths that followed the subjects of these works. No scholar, priest, or physician could explain the phenomenon. Attempts to catalog or study the surviving paintings proved futile, as canvases shifted in place or vanished entirely, reappearing in new locations as if guided by an unseen hand. The mystery deepened when reports came from households in Venice, Milan, and beyond. Families who had never set foot in Florence experienced strange occurrences, portraits delivered anonymously, shadows that moved against the light, soft cries echoing through empty rooms. Some claimed they had glimpsed the faintest outline of Matteo's silhouette in a mirror, a fleeting figure that disappeared when approached. Attempts to contact him were, of course, impossible. No trace of the painter remained in Florence beyond the burned remnants of his home and the legends that had grown around it. Yet the power attributed to him persisted. It became clear that his influence had transcended mortality. If Matteo Bianchi was dead, his technique or his curse was not. The mystery of how his brush could capture life itself, bind it to canvas, and then act autonomously defied logic. Witnesses swore the eyes in the portraits followed movement, shifted their gaze when unobserved, and even communicated faintly through subtle changes in expression. Each new appearance of a painting was accompanied by an oppressive atmosphere, a chill in the air, and an instinctual sense of dread among those present. Some theorists argued that the painter had discovered a way to trap consciousness, preserving a soul within the pigments, granting it a semi-sentience capable of acting independently. Others claimed dark rituals had imbued the artworks with life, that Matteo had bargained with forces beyond human comprehension, and that each painting was a living conduit for his power. Attempts to destroy the remaining canvases repeatedly failed. Fire would consume only the frames. The images remained untouched, colors vibrant, eyes glimmering. Scholars, driven to desperation, documented each failure in meticulous detail, only to find that no logical explanation existed. This perpetuated the legend, reinforcing the mystery with each generation. The phenomenon did not discriminate. Both commoners and nobility found themselves at risk, leading to widespread paranoia. Families locked doors and windows, covered mirrors, and restricted access to art. Yet the painter's influence seemed to slip through even the most careful precautions. It became common for households to hide paintings or seal them away, only for them to reappear unexpectedly, sometimes after the death of the intended subject. The implications of these events reached beyond superstition. Merchants feared shipping artworks. Collectors worried that acquisitions could bring misfortune. Painters were scrutinized, accused of continuing Matteo's techniques or channeling his malevolence. Florence itself became a nexus of fear and intrigue, a city forever haunted by the question of whether the painter had truly departed, or if his consciousness persisted in pigment, in oil, in brushstrokes. Legends spread of secret apprentices, cults inspired by the painter, and hidden societies seeking to uncover or exploit the method behind his terrifying mastery. Some claimed that the painter had encoded a form of immortality into his art, a mechanism by which he could perpetuate his will across time and space. Others whispered that he had simply transcended death, becoming a part of the very essence of paint, a malevolent spirit roaming the world through brushstrokes and canvases. The mysterious power of the painter cast a long shadow. Children were warned, families became cautious, and the collective consciousness of Florence absorbed the lesson. Beauty, when cursed, could destroy more than life. It could unsettle minds, warp societies, and defy comprehension. Even today, historians and art experts debate the nature of Matteo Bianchi's legacy. Some believe the surviving portraits are harmless remnants, yet anecdotal evidence continues to surface, recounting deaths, disappearances, and unexplainable phenomena linked to the artworks. The painter's methodology remains unknowable, the exact mechanism of his power lost to history. And yet the fear persists. The mystery of Matteo Bianchi is not merely about death, but about control, about the unsettling realization that life and art are not always separate, and that what is captured on canvas may not be lifeless, may not be inert, may indeed be watching. This enigma ensures that curiosity itself is dangerous. Tourists, collectors, and residents are reminded to respect the unseen, to approach beauty with caution, and to remember that some hands, once they touch a brush, can shape fate itself. The question that haunts Florence remains unresolved. Was Matteo Bianchi merely a man with extraordinary talent, or was he a conduit of forces beyond comprehension, capable of bending life into the eternal prison of paint? And, most chillingly, does his hand still reach across centuries, seeking the next subject, the next soul to capture? The mystery endures, proving that not all legends fade with time, that some horrors grow stronger in their silence, and that the boundaries of life, death, and art are sometimes more fragile than we dare imagine. The city of Florence, scarred by the legacy of Matteo Bianchi, slowly returned to a semblance of normality, yet the shadow of fear lingered in every street and alley. Families rebuilt homes, merchants reopened shops, and galleries once again displayed art. But a cautionary silence hung over the populace. Children were warned never to wander near abandoned houses. Scholars hesitated to study surviving works, and priests delivered sermons cautioning against pride, vanity, and the pursuit of immortality through craft. The ending of the painter's physical presence did not mean the conclusion of his terror. Whispers of his surviving works, of eyes that followed and shadows that moved independently, persisted in hushed conversations, carried across generations. Even when portraits were hidden or destroyed, rumors claimed new ones emerged in distant towns, each bearing the same chilling lifelike quality and the silent threat of death. Florence's citizens learned a difficult lesson. Beauty in creation, when entwined with malevolence, can wield more power than any sword, any law, any religious rite. Over the years, families adapted to a life under the unseen gaze. Mirrors were covered, rooms remained dark until the morning, and doors were locked even in daylight. Travelers arriving in the city were warned about lingering dangers, subtle signs that certain artworks carried curses beyond human understanding. Scholars documented accounts meticulously, yet no explanation could satisfy the logical mind. Physicians investigated deaths following the appearance of new portraits but found no illness, no poison, no natural cause. Each tragedy only deepened the sense of awe and terror surrounding Matteo's legacy. The painter had transcended mortality, embedding a fragment of his will into his works, ensuring that his influence persisted long after his flesh had been consumed by fire. Even as Florence flourished in commerce and culture, the psychological weight of the painter's legacy remained a constant, invisible presence. Stories were passed down, children learning from their parents the perils of pride, curiosity, and obsession with beauty. Public consciousness became a collective guardian, a societal measure designed to avoid the reach of the painter's lingering power. Museums and archives preserved surviving works under tight security. Yet even in these institutions, staff reported subtle anomalies. A whisper, a cold draft, a fleeting movement in the corner of an eye. Scholars debated the origins of such phenomena, some claiming natural causes, others insisting on supernatural intervention. These debates only reinforced the enduring mystery, cementing Matteo's reputation not only as a master painter, but as an enigma who defied death itself. Florence's culture began to reflect this caution. Art was appreciated with reverence but approached with fear. Patrons commissioned works carefully, often seeking the simplest, safest forms of representation. Artists were both celebrated and scrutinized, their every brushstroke compared against the legend of Matteo's cursed technique. The ending of his physical presence was not the ending of his influence. Across generations, stories persisted of anonymous paintings appearing mysteriously, each associated with misfortune, illness, or death. Families who had survived the initial wave of terror lived with heightened vigilance, their lives governed by superstition, habit, and learned fear. Even distant cities felt the reach of his legacy, as reports of cursed artworks traveled via merchants and travelers. Historians studying the painter faced an insurmountable challenge: to separate truth from legend, to discern whether each story reflected a real curse or collective hysteria. Yet each account reinforced the chilling pattern. The ending of Matteo Bianchi's life did not equate to closure. Instead, it marked the beginning of an ongoing trial for Florence and the wider world. Each generation inherited the cautionary tale, understanding that creativity, when combined with malevolence, could become a force beyond comprehension, and that some artistic expressions are more dangerous than weapons or poisons. As decades turned to centuries, Florence's relationship with art evolved. The city remained a center of beauty and culture, yet a subtle tension endured, a recognition that one man's hand had irrevocably altered the perception of artistic power. People lived cautiously, aware that even the most innocuous brushstroke could carry unseen consequences. The surviving works of Matteo were never displayed publicly again. They were secured, buried, or locked away, yet the mystery persisted. Stories continued to circulate, and in hushed tones, locals spoke of the painter's lingering presence. Even in modern times, the lesson remains: creation can preserve more than beauty. It can enshrine terror, trap souls, and reach across centuries. Florence's populace, scholars, and artists alike recognize the delicate boundary between life and art, and the precarious potential of genius when it is entwined with darkness. The ending of his physical life was simply the beginning of the eternal watch of his brush, his canvas, and the eyes that never closed. Those who study, admire, or even glimpse his surviving works remain under silent scrutiny, their fates uncertain, their lives shadowed by the legacy of a painter who defied mortality and bound souls to pigment and brushstroke. The legend of Matteo Bianchi did not fade with the passage of time. Instead, it became woven into the very fabric of Florence. Tourists marveled at the city's beauty, unaware of the silent eyes that watched from forgotten canvases, of shadows that moved independently of their sources, and of whispers carried on the wind that spoke of the cursed painter. Scholars and historians documented every surviving work, every report of strange occurrences, yet each record only deepened the enigma. Families who had once commissioned his art lived with perpetual caution, raising children under the weight of stories that spanned generations. Even those removed from direct contact with his works reported uncanny events, cold drafts, subtle movements, and the faintest sense of being observed. The city itself seemed to breathe with the remnants of Matteo's influence. In galleries and private collections, portraits that survived the flames retained an unnatural presence, as though the painted subjects were aware of the living, silently judging, eternally trapped. Priests who once prayed over his canvases admitted privately that the prayers seemed ineffective, that the curse was beyond divine intervention, and that some forces were untouchable by human hands. The mystery of the painter's method remained unresolved. No one could explain how a brushstroke could capture life, how pigment could hold consciousness, or why the curse persisted across centuries. Some theorized that Matteo's soul had merged with the very materials he used, creating an autonomous intelligence capable of seeking new victims. Others whispered of secret apprentices, of cults devoted to preserving and expanding his techniques, ensuring that Florence, and perhaps the world, would remain under the watchful gaze of his art. Attempts to destroy the remaining paintings were consistently met with failure. Fire consumed frames, but never the images themselves. Water, acid, and even deliberate mutilation could not deface the cursed portraits. They seemed impervious, enduring as though protected by an unseen power. Citizens of Florence learned to live with the invisible weight of this horror. Doors were locked, mirrors were covered, and rooms remained dimly lit. Travelers and merchants exercised extreme caution when handling or displaying art, fearing that even an inadvertent glance at a cursed canvas could invite disaster. The legend spread far beyond Italy, reaching distant lands where anonymous portraits arrived and deaths or disappearances followed. Florence's reputation as a cultural hub remained, but it was tempered by a collective awareness of danger. Artists were admired but approached with caution, and patrons were wary of commissioning works that might carry hidden malice. Matteo Bianchi's influence had transcended both life and geography, creating a legacy that was as much a curse as it was a testament to skill. In contemporary Florence, the story serves as both warning and fascination. Museums maintain the surviving works under strict security, and yet scholars occasionally report anomalies. Shadows shifting against light, faint whispers echoing through halls, and eyes in the portraits that seem to follow visitors. The ending, therefore, is not closure but continuity, a perpetual cycle in which art, terror, and memory intermingle. Every generation inherits the story, every individual carries the cautionary lesson, and every artist approaches creation with a heightened awareness of its potential power. The city, beautiful and bustling, lives under an invisible canopy of vigilance. Citizens understand that some genius is dangerous, that talent without morality can corrupt, and that beauty may conceal horrors unimaginable. The cursed painter's works are no longer celebrated, yet their influence pervades culture, folklore, and the collective imagination. Matteo Bianchi's ending is not a simple conclusion. It is a reminder that creation can capture more than likeness. It can imprison, influence, and endure beyond mortality. The city breathes, the paintings wait, and the eyes in pigment remain eternally alert. Those who glimpse them, study them, or even hear of them are touched by a legacy that refuses to die. And so Florence carries on, haunted yet alive, thriving yet cautious, forever marked by the dark genius of a painter whose brush captured eternity, whose art preserved terror, and whose story teaches that some creations are never meant to be understood, only survived. The cursed legacy continues, as enduring as the city's walls, as permanent as the pigment in a painting, as eternal as the fear that binds the living to the art of Matteo Bianchi.